My son-in-law locked me out of my own house. The police report he ignored came back signed. The key wouldn't turn in the lock no matter how hard I tried. I twisted it harder, my knuckles whitening from the pressure, grocery bags cutting deep lines into my fingers with their weight. Metal scraped against metal with that awful grinding sound that meant something was fundamentally wrong. Nothing happened. The lock wouldn't budge even a fraction. From inside my house that I'd owned for 23 years, I heard footsteps approaching the door slowly and deliberately. Heavy footsteps that I recognized immediately. Then I heard the deadbolt slide shut from the inside with a decisive click. My stomach dropped sickeningly into my feet. The groceries I'd just bought for dinner suddenly felt impossibly heavy in my trembling hands. I stood there frozen on my own front porch, unable to process what was happening. This was my home. My name was on every single document, every utility bill, every piece of official paperwork. Yet somehow, I couldn't get inside. The afternoon sun beat down on my shoulders, and I felt sweat starting to form on my forehead, though I couldn't tell if it was from the heat or from rising panic. The front door finally cracked open just enough for his face to appear in the narrow gap between door and frame. My son-in-law, Terrence, looked completely calm, almost bored, as if this was the most ordinary thing in the world. His expression showed no emotion whatsoever, no guilt, no uncertainty. "You don't live here anymore, Evelyn," he said flatly, his voice carrying no warmth or hesitation. Then he closed the door again before I could form words to respond. The click of the lock engaging sounded absolutely final, like a period at the end of a sentence I hadn't agreed to. I stood there staring at the wooden door, my reflection visible in the small decorative window at the top. Behind that door was everything I owned, my clothes, my photographs, my mother's jewelry, 30 years of accumulated memories and possessions. My legs felt weak beneath me. This couldn't be happening. Not in my own house. Not by someone I'd welcomed into my family just 18 months ago. The plastic grocery bag in my left hand finally tore completely from the weight and strain. Milk splashed across the wooden porch boards, spreading in a white pool that immediately began dripping through the cracks. Eggs shattered spectacularly, yolk and shell mixing with the milk in a disgusting mess that would stain the wood I'd refinished myself 3 summers ago. A neighbor across the street, Mrs. Chen from number 47, froze mid-step on her own lawn, her garden hose still running and forgotten in her hand as she stared at the scene unfolding on my porch. She pretended not to be watching, but I could see her eyes fixed on me. I was standing barefoot because I'd kicked off my work shoes in the car like I always did, locked out of my own home, groceries destroyed at my feet, and absolutely no one was coming to help me in this moment. The humiliation burned hotter than the afternoon sun. I could feel my face flushing red, my hands starting to shake uncontrollably. I pulled my phone from my purse with trembling fingers and called my daughter immediately. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, then went straight to voicemail without her voice even greeting me. I called again, my thumb stabbing at her contact photo perhaps harder than necessary. Voicemail again. A 3rd time, desperation making my movements jerky and uncoordinated. Voicemail. My chest tightened in a way that fear alone didn't fully explain. This wasn't normal. My daughter Natalie always answered my calls, even when she was busy at work. We'd always had that understanding, that connection. The fact that she wasn't answering now, combined with being locked out, created a sick feeling in my stomach that went beyond simple worry. Something was very wrong here. This wasn't a simple miscommunication or mistake. This was planned, coordinated. They discussed this beforehand, prepared for it. The realization hit me like cold water. My own daughter was part of this. She knew what was happening to me right now, Malut, and she deliberately made herself unavailable. The police officer arrived 40 minutes later, his patrol car moving slowly down the residential street. He knocked on the door with professional authority, his knuckles rapping 3 times against the wood. My son-in-law spoke through the closed door like I was nothing more than a neighborhood nuisance, some confused stranger causing problems. "Just a family disagreement, officer," Terrence said smoothly through the wood, his voice perfectly reasonable and calm. "She's a bit confused lately, gets things mixed up. We're handling it internally." The officer turned to look at me, standing there on the porch with destroyed groceries at my feet, his expression showing sympathy mixed with exhaustion. I could see in his eyes that he'd dealt with these situations before, these messy family disputes where everyone claimed ownership and righteousness. He asked me a few basic questions, took down some notes in his little pad. Then he left without forcing the door open, without demanding Terrence let me inside. "Civil matter," he said apologetically. "You'll need to handle this through the courts." I watched his patrol car disappear down the street, taking my last hope with it. The porch light shut off abruptly at exactly 9 o'clock, plunging me into darkness lit only by distant street lamps. I sat in my car in the driveway, my hands shaking violently on the steering wheel, staring at the house I'd paid for with 23 years of mortgage payments. The house where I'd raised my daughter alone after my husband died. The house where every room held memories I'd carefully built and protected. Now I couldn't even get inside to retrieve my nighttime medication or a change of clothes. The absurdity of the situation kept hitting me in waves. How had this happened? How had I lost control of my own home to a man I'd known less than 2 years? I'd welcomed him into my family, into my house, with open arms and genuine warmth. And this was how he repaid that trust and generosity, by changing my locks and treating me like an unwanted intruder. As I sat there in the darkness, something shifted inside me. The fear and confusion began hardening into something else entirely, determination mixed with cold calculation. My name is Evelyn Porter, and I'm 61 years old. I've worked as a records clerk at the county administration office for 37 years, managing property documents, deed transfers, and legal filings. I understand bureaucracy and paperwork better than most lawyers. The house behind that locked door, the house I couldn't currently access, was legally and completely mine in every way that mattered. My name was on the deed, recorded and filed properly with the county, 23 years ago, when my late husband and I purchased it together. After he died 12 years ago from a sudden heart attack, I'd refinanced it entirely in my name. Every utility bill, every property tax payment, every homeowner's insurance premium, all in my name, all paid from my bank account. I had documentation for everything, meticulously organized in both physical and digital files. What Terrence didn't understand, what he'd fatally underestimated, was that I didn't just work with legal documents. I knew exactly how to use them as weapons when necessary. They'd moved in right after the wedding, barely 18 months ago now. "Just for a little while, Mom," Natalie had said, her eyes pleading in that way that always melted my resistance. "Just until we save enough for our own place. 6 months, maybe 8 at most. You have all this extra room since I moved out anyway." I'd believed her completely and without question. Why wouldn't I? She was my daughter, my only child, and I wanted her to be happy and financially secure. Terrence had seemed nice enough at first, polite, respectful, full of ambitious plans about starting his own contracting business. He'd shaken my hand firmly at dinner and thanked me repeatedly for my generosity. I'd prepared the guest room for them, bought new linens, cleared out closet space. I'd imagined having my daughter close again, sharing meals and conversations like we used to before she moved away for college. It had seemed like a perfect arrangement that would benefit everyone involved. I should have seen the warning signs immediately. I should have trusted my first instincts. At first, Terrence offered help around the house constantly, which seemed thoughtful and considerate. He'd fix the leaking faucet I'd been meaning to call a plumber about. He'd mow the lawn without being asked. Then gradually, almost imperceptibly, the helpful suggestions became opinions about how I should be doing things differently. The opinions became instructions delivered with increasing authority. "You shouldn't park there, Evelyn. That's where I need to put my truck. We're having people over Saturday, so you'll need to make other plans. That furniture arrangement doesn't work. We're moving things around." Each small change seemed reasonable in isolation, easy to accept for the sake of household harmony. But collectively, they represented something much larger and more troubling, a systematic takeover of my home and my autonomy. I found myself asking permission to have friends visit my own house. I started checking with them before making dinner plans. Without realizing exactly when it happened, I'd stopped being the homeowner and become a guest in my own space. My mail started disappearing first, which I initially attributed to postal service errors. Then I noticed it had been redirected to a post office box without my authorization. My bedroom, the master bedroom I'd occupied for over 2 decades, was suddenly deemed too large for one person and became temporary while they took it over. Their belongings spread throughout the house like an invasive species, crowding out my possessions into smaller and smaller spaces. My favorite reading chair was moved to the basement because it didn't match the aesthetic. Family photos were taken down and replaced with their wedding pictures and Terrence's amateur artwork. The thermostat settings changed to his preferences. The television was always tuned to his shows. Even the kitchen, where I'd cooked thousands of meals, became his domain with his rules about organization and cleanliness. My house progressively stopped feeling like home with each passing week. It felt like being slowly erased, having my presence and history systematically replaced by someone else's vision. And through it all, Natalie remained silent or actively supported his decisions, choosing her new husband over her mother in every single conflict. Every concern I raised was immediately smoothed over with practiced explanations that made me feel unreasonable for even mentioning them. "Mom, he's just stressed about the business not taking off as fast as he hoped. You know how he is. He likes things organized a certain way. It's not personal. Can't you just try to be more understanding? We're all living together. We have to compromise." But compromise only seemed to flow in one direction. Mine toward his preferences, never the reverse. I swallowed every word of protest, every surge of anger, every moment of indignation. I told myself I was being the mature one, the flexible one, the good mother who supported her daughter's marriage even when it was difficult. I convinced myself this situation was temporary, that they'd move out soon like promised, and then I'd reclaim my space and independence. Looking back now from my car in the driveway, I could see how thoroughly I'd been manipulated and controlled. How my natural desire to avoid conflict and support my daughter had been weaponized against me systematically and deliberately. The lock change hadn't been sudden or impulsive like a moment of anger. It had been carefully planned and precisely timed for maximum effect. They'd waited specifically for the day I worked late at the county office for our quarterly inventory, a schedule I'd mentioned weeks in advance. I'd left that morning at my normal time, saying goodbye and mentioning I'd be home around 8 instead of my usual 5:30. That gave them hours to change every lock on every door, front, back, garage, even the basement entrance I rarely used. They'd hired a locksmith, paid in cash probably, and had new keys made that deliberately excluded me. When I'd finally arrived home after that exhausting 10-hour workday, tired and looking forward to a quiet evening, I'd found myself completely locked out with no warning and no explanation beyond Terrence's cold statement through the door. The premeditation of it made everything worse somehow. This wasn't a heat-of-the-moment decision or a temporary measure during an argument. This was calculated, planned, and executed with cold efficiency. Terrence thought authority came purely from confidence and force of personality. He'd always been that way, I realize now, speaking louder than everyone else, making decisions without consultation, assuming his way was obviously correct. He genuinely believed that possession and presence equaled ownership and control. If he occupied the house and controlled access to it, then he must own it in every way that mattered. What he'd never bothered to do, what his arrogance had prevented him from doing, was actually check any legal paperwork. He'd never asked to see the deed. He'd never verified whose name was on the property tax bills. He'd never questioned who held the title or paid the mortgage. He'd simply assumed that because he was the man, because he was younger and more physically imposing, because he spoke with such absolute certainty that he must have some legitimate claim to authority. That assumption, that fatal overconfidence in his own position, was going to cost him everything. He'd locked out the wrong person. He'd underestimated someone who understood exactly how power actually worked in the legal system. The next morning, after spending an uncomfortable night at a budget motel, I went directly to the police station before work. Not emotional this time, not crying or confused. I was calm, professional, exact. I filed an official police report for illegal lockout and provided documentation. A copy of my deed showing sole ownership, 3 months of utility bills in my name, my driver's license showing the property address as my legal residence. The officer taking the report was different from the one who'd come to the house yesterday. He was older, more thorough, and he actually read through everything I provided carefully. "Ma'am, this is pretty clear-cut," he said, making copies of all my documents. "This is your property. They can't legally lock you out, regardless of any verbal agreements or family relationships. I'll make sure this report is processed immediately and forwarded to the appropriate department." He handed me a case number and copies of everything. "Keep these safe. You'll need them for court." Court. The word hung in the air between us. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. The formal notice was delivered to my house, to Terrence, 3 days later by certified mail requiring signature. I knew because I'd tracked it obsessively online, refreshing the Postal Service website every hour to see its status update. He'd signed for it at 11:23 in the morning. I imagined him opening that official envelope, seeing the police report number, reading the legal language about unlawful eviction and property rights violations. I thought maybe, possibly, he'd realize the seriousness of what he'd done and contact me to resolve this before it escalated further. Instead, according to my friend who still lived across the street and was keeping me informed, he'd laughed it off completely. He'd actually stood on my front porch, his porch as he apparently thought of it now, waving the notice around and telling neighbors it was nothing, just Evelyn being dramatic and vindictive because we asked her to contribute to household expenses. Confidence, I was learning, could be extraordinarily expensive. His dismissal of official legal documentation was the second major mistake he'd made. His first was locking me out. His second was ignoring the consequences. I spent my lunch breaks for the next week requesting and collecting copies of every relevant document I could need. Working in the county records office had significant advantages in situations like this. I knew exactly which forms to request, which departments to contact, which details mattered most for legal proceedings. I pulled the original deed showing the property transfer to my late husband and myself 23 years ago. I pulled the refinancing documents from 12 years ago, showing the transfer to my sole ownership after his death. I pulled every property tax payment record going back a decade, all showing my name and my bank account. I pulled utility connection records, homeowners insurance policies, even the title information for my car that listed the house as my garaging address. I made multiple copies of everything, organizing them chronologically in clearly labeled folders. Ink doesn't forget, I thought grimly as I assembled the documentation. People might lie or misremember, but official records told the truth with absolute clarity. I was building a case that was completely airtight and utterly undeniable. Terrence's first major legal error came when he tried to establish residency rights, apparently following advice from some friend or internet forum. He filed paperwork claiming he was a legal tenant who'd been living at the property for 18 months and paying rent. Therefore, he had rights against unlawful eviction. Except he'd filled out the wrong form entirely. He'd used a commercial lease dispute form instead of a residential one. And more critically, he'd signed his name as Terrence Williams, primary resident, on a document that clearly asked for property owner information. That signature, that claim of primary residency in writing on an official document, was going to destroy any argument he might have made about confusion or misunderstanding. He'd put in writing with his actual signature that he believed himself to be the primary resident with authority over the property. The form was filed with the county clerk's office, which meant it was now part of the official public record. The clerk who processed it happened to be someone I'd worked with for 15 years. She'd called me immediately, deeply concerned, asking if I knew someone had filed tenancy claims on my property. The court date was set for 3 weeks after my initial filing, which was relatively fast for the civil court system. I'd requested an emergency hearing for a legal lockout, and the judge had apparently agreed that the situation warranted quick resolution. I received my notification by mail and by email, with clear instructions about where to appear, what to bring, and what to expect from the proceedings. I prepared meticulously, organizing every document in chronological order with colored tabs for easy reference. I rehearsed what I'd say if asked questions, keeping my responses factual and unemotional. Terrence also received notification at the house address, my house address, by certified mail just like the police report. He signed for it on a Tuesday afternoon. The hearing was scheduled for Thursday morning at 9 o'clock. I arrived at the courthouse at 8:15, found the correct courtroom, and sat in the hallway reviewing my documents one final time. 9 o'clock came. 9:15. 9:30. Terrence never showed up. He apparently thought the court summons was as meaningless and ignorable as the police report had been. That decision, that breathtaking arrogance, sealed his fate completely and irrevocably. The judge was a woman in her late 50s with steel gray hair and reading glasses that she peered over with sharp, intelligent eyes. She read through everything I'd submitted slowly and carefully, taking her time with each document and occasionally making notes on a legal pad. She read the deed showing my sole ownership. She read the utility bills spanning 2 years. She read the police report about the illegal lockout. She read Terrence's own filed paperwork claiming primary residency. She read the documentation showing he'd changed the locks without my permission or knowledge. Finally, she looked up at me sitting alone at the plaintiff's table. "Mrs. Porter, is the defendant here?" she asked. "No, Your Honor," I replied quietly. He was properly served and notified of this hearing date. She made another note, then looked at me directly. "This is remarkably clear-cut. You have sole legal ownership of the property in question. The defendant has illegally excluded you from your own home and has filed false claims of residency rights. In his absence, and based on this documentation, I'm ruling entirely in your favor." Then she signed the order with a pen that made scratching sounds in the quiet courtroom. The document came back from the courthouse stamped with the official seal and marked "Final Order" in red letters across the top. I held it in my hands, reading through the legal language that gave me everything I'd requested. Immediate restoration of access to my property. Legal recognition that Terrence had no tenancy rights or ownership claims. Authorization for law enforcement assistance in removing unauthorized occupants if necessary. An order requiring return of all keys and changed locks to be restored to my specifications. Even a provision for recovering my costs and legal fees associated with the lockout. The power that Terrence had mocked, the official systems he'd dismissed as meaningless bureaucracy, had now turned against him with absolute authority. This wasn't a suggestion or a request. This was a court order backed by the full weight of the legal system. The judge's signature at the bottom looked almost beautiful to me. Proof that justice, while sometimes slow, did eventually arrive. I made 5 copies immediately, keeping 1 in my purse, 1 in my car, 1 at work, and 2 in my safe deposit box. This document was my weapon and my shield. This time when the knock came on my door, legally and officially confirmed now, it was the sheriff's department, not a patrol officer. 2 deputies in uniform, 1 male and 1 female, both looking official and serious. They weren't there to mediate or suggest solutions. They were there to execute a court order, which they did with professional efficiency and absolutely no patience for arguments or explanations. I stood on the sidewalk watching as they knocked, identified themselves through the door, and gave Terrence exactly 60 seconds to open it before they'd force entry. The door opened. Terrence's face appeared, and for the first time since this entire nightmare began, I saw uncertainty in his expression instead of confidence. The deputies handed him copies of the court order and explained in clear, simple terms what was going to happen now. He had 2 hours to gather personal belongings and vacate the property. The locks would be changed immediately by a locksmith the sheriff's department was bringing. Any resistance would result in his immediate arrest for contempt of court. His confidence evaporated in seconds, replaced by sputtering protests about unfairness and his rights. The deputies were completely unmoved. My daughter appeared in the doorway behind Terrence, and seeing her face broke something inside me despite everything that had happened. She looked exhausted, pale, much thinner than I remembered. Her eyes were red from crying, and when she saw me standing there on the sidewalk with the sheriff's deputies, she started crying again. "Mom," she said, her voice breaking. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I didn't know he was going to lock you out. I didn't know about any of this until it was already done. I've been trying to call you, but he took my phone. I tried to leave twice, and he wouldn't let me." The pieces clicked into place suddenly and horribly. The ignored calls, her silence during the lockout, her absence from all the proceedings. She hadn't been complicit, she'd been controlled, possibly trapped. I walked up the pathway to the porch and pulled her into my arms, holding her while she sobbed against my shoulder. "It's okay," I said quietly, stroking her hair like I used to when she was small and scared. "It's okay now. You're safe." But I didn't change the outcome. The order stood. They both had to leave. By afternoon, there were boxes stacked on the front lawn, their belongings packed hastily and without care. Terrence's tools, his clothes, his electronics, all piled into cardboard boxes and black garbage bags. The locksmith had already changed every lock, and I held the new keys in my hand, feeling their weight and significance. Terrence stood next to his truck, loading boxes with angry, jerky movements, his face dark with rage. He wouldn't look at me directly, but I could feel his hatred radiating across the yard. My daughter sat in the passenger seat of my car, having made her choice clear. She was staying with me, leaving him, done with the marriage that had become a prison. The deputies waited until every last box was loaded and the truck pulled away from the curb before they left. The street fell quiet. Neighbors who'd been watching from windows slowly retreated. And I stood there on my porch, my home, my property, looking at the space where arrogance used to live, and feeling absolutely nothing but relief. I changed the locks again a week later, just to be absolutely certain. I had security cameras installed at every entrance. I updated my will to ensure clear inheritance instructions. And then, after 2 months of reclaiming my space and helping my daughter heal from what I now understood had been an abusive and controlling relationship, I made a decision. I sold the house. Not because Terrence had won, or because the memories were too painful, but because I realized I didn't want to live there anymore. That house had become a battlefield, a place of conflict and pain. I wanted to start completely fresh somewhere new, somewhere lighter, somewhere untouched by this entire nightmare. The sale went through quickly. Good neighborhood, well-maintained property, fair price. I split the proceeds with my daughter, giving her the financial stability to start her own life separately and safely. We moved together into a smaller house across town, one with both our names on the deed and no guest room. I felt freer than I had in years, lighter without the weight of that particular property and all its associated trauma. Terrence thought power meant possession and physical control. He believed that confidence and aggression equaled authority, that speaking loudly made him right, that changing locks gave him ownership. I proved that real power meant understanding how systems actually work, patience to let processes unfold properly, proof in the form of meticulous documentation, and knowing you're worth enough to fight for it through proper channels instead of force. I didn't raise my voice during any of this, not once. I didn't scream or threaten or resort to his tactics of intimidation. Instead, I raised my life above his attempts to diminish it. I used the law, used documentation, used the very bureaucracy he'd dismissed as meaningless. And I never asked for his permission again. Not to enter my home, not to reclaim my property, not to rebuild my life on my own terms. My daughter and I were both free now, both learning to trust ourselves again, both understanding that sometimes the quietest resistance is the most powerful. Ink doesn't forget. Courts don't ignore their own orders. And underestimating a woman who knows exactly how the system works is the most expensive mistake anyone can make.